Nora Vance was 22 years old, and she owned almost nothing but the mud on her boots and a canvas backpack that had been mended more times than she could count. She had no home waiting for her that autumn, no family expecting a phone call, and the last of her money had gone to a bus ticket that carried her into a county she had never seen. 3 days before this story truly begins, an old woman named Martha Holloway died in a farmhouse fire, and the world decided almost at once that the woman had left behind nothing worth remembering. Everyone believed the place was worthless. Everyone believed there was nothing out there but a burned frame and a heap of ash. And yet, beneath the collapsed floor of that ruined house, sealed inside a crock the flames could not touch, waited something that would make an entire town remember a woman even her neighbours thought they had already forgotten. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about a burned farmhouse, it's a story about belonging, and about the quiet love that outlives the person who gave it. The town was called Elder Creek, a scatter of farms and one gas station along a country lane where the maples had already begun to turn. Nora had come north chasing seasonal work, apple picking, anything that paid in cash and asked no questions. She had grown up in a string of foster homes, and she had learned early that the safest thing to own was nothing, because nothing could be taken from you in the night. She kept her whole life in that backpack, a change of clothes, a tin cup, a photograph so worn the faces had gone soft as breath on glass. She could not have told you why she still carried it, only that a person who owns nothing needs at least one thing to prove she once belonged to someone. On her first cold morning in Elder Creek, standing outside the gas station with exactly enough coins for a candy bar and a coffee she would nurse for an hour, Nora watched a man in a torn coat count and recount the change in his palm. His hands shook. He was older than her father would have been, and he was hungry in the particular way that has stopped being an emergency and become a habit. He put the coins back in his pocket and turned away from the counter with nothing, the small, defeated turn of a man who has done it many times before. Nora looked at her own coins. She had learned to measure a day in them. Then she thought of every morning she had gone without, of every stranger who might have helped her and had not, and she stepped forward and bought the man a coffee and a wrapped sandwich, and she pressed her last folded bill into his hand besides. "I can't take this from you," the man said. His voice was rough as a gravel road. "You're not taking it," Nora answered. "I'm giving it. There's a difference." He held her gaze a long moment. Then he said something she would not understand until much later, something that would sit in her chest like a warm coal all through what came after. "Kindness like that finds its way home," he told her. "Sometimes it takes the long road, but it always comes back." She smiled, embarrassed, and walked out into the pale sun with empty pockets and a lighter heart than she had any right to feel. And that, though she did not know it yet, was the morning her whole life quietly turned. It was the dog she noticed first. He came down the lane at dawn the very next day, a shaggy farm dog the colour of wet straw, and he moved on 3 legs with a rhythm so practised it took Nora a moment to see that the 4th was missing at all. He did not beg, he did not bark. He simply crossed the road with the grave purpose of an old man walking to church, and he sat down at the edge of a blackened ruin, facing what had once been a front door, and he waited. "That's Marta's dog," said the woman who ran the gas station, following Nora's stare. Her name was Ruth, and she had the tired kindness of a person who had watched too many hard things happen to good people. "They pulled him out of the shelter twice this week. He keeps going back to the house." "What house?" Nora asked. "The Holloway place. Marta lived there alone near 40 years. Fire took it Tuesday last and took her with it." Ruth wiped the counter without looking at it. "Folks say the wiring was bad. Old house, old wires." She never had 2 coins to rub together, poor soul. The county's already calling it a total loss. Nothing left out there worth the gravel to reach it. Nora looked at the dog. The dog looked at the door that was no longer there. What happened to his leg? Truck, they say, years back. Marta found him in a ditch, half dead, and paid the county shelter what little she had to fix him up. That shelter would have put him down otherwise. Ruth shook her head. She loved that animal more than most people love their own kin. And now look at him. Won't eat, won't stay put. Just keeps coming home to a house that isn't there anymore. Something in Nora went very still. She knew that particular loyalty. She had spent her whole childhood being the one who kept coming back to doors that had closed, standing on porches that no longer wanted her, and here was a creature doing the same. Only he had loved someone worth the waiting. That night, the rain came down in cold silver ropes, and Nora, who was sleeping in the loft of Ruth's barn in exchange for morning chores, could not stop thinking about the 3-legged dog out in the weather. Near midnight, she pulled on her coat and walked the muddy lane with a flashlight, and there he was, soaked to the bone, sitting exactly where he had sat at dawn, patient as a stone, watching the ruin as though at any moment the door might open and the old woman might call him in. "You'll catch your death," Nora whispered. The dog turned his head, his eyes caught the flashlight and shone gold. And then he did something that stopped her breath. He stood, limped to a particular corner of the wreckage, and began to paw at the charred boards, urgently, insistently, whining low in his throat. He pawed at the same spot he must have worked 100 nights. Then he looked back at her, and she understood, the way you understand a thing before you have the words for it, that he was not mourning. He was trying to show her something. A road surveyor. That was the plain fact of what Nora had almost forgotten she still was, in another life before the money ran out. She had studied it 2 years at a community college, land and lines and the honest arithmetic of the earth, before the last grant fell through. She knew how a floor was framed. She knew that a pantry in a house that age would have been built over a shallow root cellar, and that a root cellar would have a floor of its own, lower and colder than the rest. She knelt in the rain beside the dog and shone her light where he pawed. Beneath the fallen boards, where the pantry had stood, the fire had burned hot and then collapsed inward, and there in the black hollow she saw the dull curve of something the flames had not eaten. Something round. Something made to survive exactly this. Stay with me here, because what the dog had been guarding was not grief at all. It was an errand. An old woman had left one last task in the world, and for 3 nights her dog had been trying to hand it to whoever would finally follow him into the dark. Nora did not touch it that night. Some instinct told her this was not a thing to be pulled out alone in the rain by flashlight, half a secret, half a theft. She marked the spot in her mind, coaxed the shivering dog back to the barn with her, dried him with an old horse blanket, and let him sleep pressed warm against her spine. He smelled of wet ash and cold earth, and he trembled a long while before he settled, and only when her hand rested on his ribs did his breathing finally slow. In the morning she went to Ruth, and Ruth went to the county, and by afternoon a small serious group stood at the ruin. Ruth, a sheriff's deputy named Cole, with mild eyes and a notebook, and Nora, with the dog leaning against her leg as if he had decided, without asking anyone, that she was his now. It took them the better part of an hour to lift the fallen boards, without bringing the rest down, and then Cole reached into the cold hollow of the old root cellar and drew out a stoneware crock the size of a milk pail, glazed the deep brown of river mud, its heavy lid sealed with a rind of candle wax gone hard as amber. Fireproof, near enough. The kind of crock a frugal farm woman would have kept for lard or salt pork, repurposed now for something she meant to last. On the lid, scratched into the glaze with a nail in a shaky, deliberate hand, were 3 words: "For whoever comes." "Well," said Cole quietly, and no one else said anything at all. They opened it there, out of the wind, with the dog watching every hand. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, was a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, a thin cloth pouch heavy with folded bills and coins, a bank passbook soft with handling, and a single long envelope with a name written across the front in that same shaky hand. Nora expected the name to be a stranger's, a lawyer, a nephew, someone with a claim. The envelope said, "For the person who feeds my dog." Ruth made a small sound and pressed her knuckles to her mouth. Cole looked at Nora, and Nora looked at the dog, and the dog looked up at Nora as though the matter had been settled between them the previous night in the rain. "I think," Ruth said thickly, "that would be you, honey." They agreed she should be the one to read it. So Nora sat on a scorched stone that had once been a doorstep, with the 3-legged dog's chin heavy on her knee, and she opened the letter, and she read it aloud into the cold, bright morning, and the old woman's voice came up off the page, as though Martha Holloway had never gone into the fire at all. "If you are reading this, then I have finally run out of nights, and my good boy has done what I asked him to do. He will have brought you here. He is stubborn about the things that matter, that dog, and I taught him that on purpose. So first, thank you. Whoever you are, you stopped for a hungry animal or a heap of ashes when you had no reason to, and that tells me everything I need to know about you." Nora's throat tightened. She read on. "My name is Martha Holloway. I am 81 years old, and I have lived on this land my whole life, and for most of it people believed I had nothing. They were right about the money and wrong about everything else. I want to tell you where this little bit of savings must go, and I want to tell you why, because the why is the only part that matters." The dog sighed against her knee. Nora turned the page. "Years ago, I found a dog in a ditch with his leg crushed and the light going out of his eyes. Everyone told me to let him be, that he was worthless, that it was money thrown after nothing, but the county shelter took him in when I couldn't pay, and a young woman there worked on him through the night for no wages at all, and she saved him, and she never once made me feel small for being poor. That shelter runs on scraps and prayers. So every dollar I have set aside, and it is more than anyone guessed, because a woman who wants nothing can save a great deal over a long life. Every dollar goes to them. Let it be my thank you. Paid at last." Ruth was weeping openly now, without shame. Cole had taken off his hat. "But money is the smallest thing in this crock," Nora read, and her own voice broke, and she steadied it. "The letters are the true inheritance. Read them if you like. They are 40 years of the people this county forgot, the ones I fed at my back door, the ones I hid from bad husbands, the runaway boy I drove to his grandmother 3 states over. I wrote down every one, not as charity I was owed, but as a life I got to touch. I was never nobody. I only looked like nobody. Remember that, whoever you are. The world is full of people who are somebody in secret. Understand what had just happened on that scorched doorstep. This was not a treasure hunt with a prize at the bottom. This was a confession of love, laid down plank by plank across 40 quiet years by a woman the whole town had written off as having nothing to leave. The money was the least of it. The money was almost an afterthought. What Martha Holloway had truly buried beneath her pantry floor was the proof that a small, poor, unnoticed life had been, all along, one of the richest in the county. And there was one more line, the last, and Nora read it in a whisper. "Take care of my boy. He has one bad leg and a whole good heart, and he does not do well alone. Promise me you'll keep him. Promise me he won't have to wait at any more doors. The dog lifted his head at the sound of it, as though the words were meant for him. "I promise," Nora said, before she had decided to say anything at all. "I promise." That word would follow her through everything that came next, the way a vow does when it is made without calculation. She had made few promises in her life, because a promise is a kind of belonging, and belonging was the one thing she had never been permitted to keep. But this one she meant with her whole chest. She thought that was the last of it. The letter and the promise and the crock emptied out on the doorstep. It was not. When she tilted the crock to set it down, something shifted at the very bottom, hidden beneath a false disc of the same brown stoneware, cut so cleverly it had passed for the base itself. Cole worked it loose with the tip of his knife, and underneath lay one more thing, wrapped in a square of faded quilt, a child's shoe, small and worn, laced with a ribbon gone the colour of old tea. Nobody said a word. There was no letter with this one, no line of explanation, only the little shoe and the sense that it had been the most precious thing the old woman owned. She had a daughter, Ruth murmured at last, as though the memory had surfaced from very deep water. Long, long time ago. The baby didn't live out her first winter. Marta never spoke of it once in 40 years. She pressed the quilt back over the shoe with great gentleness. I always wondered why a woman with that much love in her never had anyone to give it to. Now I know. She gave it to everyone. She just never told us who she was giving it for, and Nora understood, in a way she did not yet have language for, that every stranger Marta had fed at her back door, every runaway she had driven through the dark, every starving dog she had paid to save, had been a small candle lit for a child who never got to grow up. The old woman had spent 40 years mothering a whole county in the name of the one person she could not keep. That was the true bottom of the crock. That was the thing the fire could never have reached. What followed was not an ending, but a beginning, and it began with the money, though the money, as Marta had insisted, was never the point. The pouch and the passbook together came to a sum that made Cole whistle low and made Ruth sit down hard on the doorstep. It was enough to matter. It was far more than a woman who bought day-old bread and darned her stockings should have been able to hoard, and every cent of it had been earned by wanting nothing so that she could one day give everything. The passbook named the county animal shelter as the recipient in Marta's cramped hand, dated across many years of small deposits, a nickel and a dollar, and sometimes more, laid down as patiently as a canyon is carved by water, without ever once being told it was doing something grand. But money in a crock is only a promise until someone keeps it, and there were people in Elder Creek who thought the promise ought to bend their way. The first was a man named Del Prewitt, who arrived the following week in a silver pickup with a real estate sign already magnetized to the door. He owned the land on 3 sides of the Holloway place, and he had wanted the Holloway acres for a decade, and he stood in the ash with his thumbs in his belt and explained to Nora, slowly, as if she was simple, that the estate of a woman with no heirs reverted to the county, that the county would sell, and that he intended to buy. "There's nothing here for you," Prewitt said. "Burned lot, dead dog's owner, a jar of an old lady's mad money. You seem like a nice girl. Go on and let the grown-ups handle the paperwork." The 3-legged dog growled from somewhere deep in his chest. "The savings are already spoken for," Nora said evenly. "In writing. Notarized before she died. It turns out Ruth found the copy at the bank. It goes to the shelter. All of it." Prewitt's smile thinned. "That's so. That's so. And the land?" "That," Nora said, "is not for sale to a man who calls her jar of mad money the only thing worth mentioning about a life. He left angry, and he did not leave for good. He came back twice more that month, once with a surveyor of his own to mark a fence line that crept a little onto Marta's acres, and once alone, at dusk, when he thought no one was watching. Nora found him standing in the ash near the pantry hollow, kicking at the boards with the toe of his boot, and Buck placed himself between the man and the ground where the croc had lain, ears flat, a low sound rolling in his chest. "There's nothing down there anymore," Nora said quietly from the lane. "You're too late for whatever you're looking for." Pruitt did not turn around at first. People say she had money hid all over this place, coffee cans, mason jars in the walls. He finally looked at her, and there was something almost hungry and almost sad in his face. 40 years I lived next to that woman, and never once did she ask me for a thing. Made me feel like I was the poor one. He spat into the ash. A person like that has no right to make a man feel small. "She wasn't trying to make you feel anything," Nora said. "She was just busy loving people who couldn't pay her back. You could have been one of them. The door was open to you too." He had no answer for that. He got in his silver pickup and drove off, and though he would fight her yet in the meeting room, some part of the fight had already gone out of him, because a greedy man cannot stay greedy for long in the face of a kindness that never once wanted anything from him. For a stretch of that autumn, it still truly seemed he might win, because the county was slow and the law was a maze, and Nora had no money for lawyers and no name in that town at all. There were nights she sat in Ruth's barn with the dog's weight against her and wondered what right she had to any of it, an orphan drifter who had blown in with the leaves. But every dawn the dog went down the lane to the ruin and sat facing the vanished door, and every dawn Nora followed him, and slowly the ritual stopped being about grief. It became about a plan. She was a surveyor, or had been. So one clear morning she took a length of string and a line level and her own 2 eyes, and she walked the Holloway acres as Marta must have walked them 10,000 times, and she saw what a hurried county assessor had missed. The land was not worthless. The lower field held a spring that ran clean and cold even in that dry year. The soil in the bottoms was black and deep, and the ruined house sat on a stone foundation a century old and still square, still true, ready to carry a new frame if anyone cared to raise one. Everyone believed it was worthless, Ruth said, reading over her shoulder at the survey Nora had sketched by lamplight, same as they believed Marta was. They were wrong about her, Nora said. So maybe they're wrong about this too. Stay with me, because this is the moment the whole story turns, the moment a burned lot stopped being the end of an old woman's life and started to become the beginning of many others. The idea, when it came, arrived all at once and felt less like invention than like remembering. Marta's savings would go to the shelter, as promised, untouched, that was sacred. But the letters, those 40 years of the forgotten and the fed, gave Nora another notion entirely. She would not sell the land to Del Pruitt. She would give the shelter more than money. She would give it a home. She took the letters to the county, and she took Ruth, and she took the deputy Cole, who had grown quietly fond of the whole strange business. And she stood up in a small meeting room and read Marta's letters aloud to a table of tired officials who had come expecting to rubber stamp a sale. She told them about the runaway boy Marta had driven to his grandmother 3 states over. She read the letter about the woman hidden from a husband with heavy fists. Then she gave them the story of a starving dog nobody would fix, and the young shelter worker who mended him anyway for nothing, and the 40 years of grateful nickels that followed. This land isn't a burned lot, Nora told them when she had finished. It's the last thing a woman spent her whole life quietly building. She fed this county at her back door for 2 generations. Let her keep feeding it. Let the shelter that saved her dog build a barn out here on her good foundation, on her clean spring, and let it be named for her, so that the next starving animal and the next lost person has a door that opens. That's not charity. That's just finishing what she started. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, an old man at the end of the table, the county clerk, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes and said, "I knew Martha Holloway 40 years. Sold her stamps at the post office. Never once guessed." He put his glasses back on. "I move, we hear her out properly." Del Pruitt objected, of course. He objected loudly, and he objected often, and he brought a lawyer of his own. But a strange thing happens to a greedy man in a room full of people who have just been reminded what generosity looks like. He begins to look exactly like what he is. When Pruitt stood and argued that sentiment was no basis for policy, that the county owed nothing to a dead pauper, that the practical course was to sell to the highest bidder and be done, he was undone not by Nora, but by his own words. A woman in the back of the room, grey-haired and plain, stood up shaking. "That dead pauper," she said, "hid me and my babies in her cellar for a winter when my husband would have killed us. I've got one of those letters at home. She never told a soul." She looked at Pruitt. "You want to buy her land cheap and put up storage units. I want you to sit down." He sat down. By the time that autumn had burned itself out into the first bare cold of winter, the thing was decided. The county deeded the Holloway acres for the price of $1 to the animal shelter as a permanent sanctuary, on the condition it bear Martha's name. The savings from the crock built the first of it, and Nora Vance, who had arrived owning nothing but the mud on her boots, discovered that the town had quietly decided she was the one who ought to run it. "You followed the dog," Ruth said simply, when Nora tried to protest that she had no claim. "Nobody else did. You're the person who feeds her dog." She wrote it down herself. They rebuilt through the spring. Neighbours came who had received no letter and needed none. Because a story like that travels a county in a week. Cole framed the walls on his days off, and Nora caught the shy, steady way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, and did not mind it. The grey-haired woman from the meeting planted the garden, and on the old stone foundation, exactly where the pantry had been, exactly over the cold hollow where the crock had waited 3 days for someone to follow a 3-legged dog through the rain, they built the memorial wall. It was not a grand thing. It was a low fieldstone wall with a wide oak shelf set into it, and on the shelf sat a lantern that was lit every evening at dusk and left to burn down through the dark. Into the stone above it they set a plank saved from the ruin, sanded smooth and carved with words Nora chose from the letter. "I was never nobody. I only looked like nobody," and beneath that, smaller, the Holloway Sanctuary A door that opens. On the morning they finished it, the whole town came out along the country lane, and the maples were green now instead of gold, and the 3-legged dog walked the length of the new wall on his 3 good-enough legs, and sniffed the base of the lantern shelf, and for the first time since the fire, did not sit down to wait. He lay down in the sun instead, in front of the open sanctuary door, with the air of a creature whose long errand was finally completely done. Nora signed the adoption papers that same afternoon at a folding table set up in the new yard, with Cole as her witness and Ruth crying happily into a paper napkin. The county had a form for it. She wrote her name, and then, in the box that asked for the animal's name, she paused, because in all the weeks of following him she had never once learned what Martha had called him. It was Ruth who remembered. "Buck," she said softly. She called him Buck, said he had more backbone than most men she'd met. So Nora wrote it down, Buck, and the 3-legged dog thumped his tail once against the new-laid stone, as if to say that yes, that was right, that had always been his name, and now the last door was open and he could rest. That evening, as she had every evening since the wall was raised, Nora lit the lantern on the shelf. And standing there in the blue dusk with Buck warm against her leg. She finally understood the words the hungry man had said to her outside the gas station on her very first cold morning in Elder Creek, before any of this began. Kindness like that finds its way home. Sometimes it takes the long road, but it always comes back. She had given away her last coins to a stranger, and she had thought that was the end of it. She had not known that a poor old woman, dead 3 days, had already left instructions in a fireproof crock for exactly the kind of person who would do such a thing. She had not known that a stubborn, 3-legged dog had been sitting in the rain, night after night, waiting for someone kind enough and patient enough to follow him into the dark. The coins had come back. They had taken the long road, through a fire and a ruin and a jar sealed with candle wax, but they had come back to her as a home, a purpose, and a friend who would never again have to wait at a door alone. She had arrived believing she had been left nothing. She learned, that spring, that she had been left the most valuable thing of all. Because here is the truth that Martha Holloway spent 40 years quietly proving, and that a burned farmhouse and a 3-legged dog finally carried out into the light. The most valuable inheritance is rarely money or property. It is the love a person tends in secret, the doors they leave unlocked for strangers, the small kindnesses they save up like coins and pass along to whoever is finally paying attention. Martha looked like nobody. She was one of the richest women who ever lived in that county, and almost no one knew it until a dog and a drifter and a fireproof crock told the tale. The lantern still burns every night on the fieldstone wall in Elder Creek. The door still opens for the starved and the lost, animal and human alike. And a woman who once kept her whole life in a mended backpack now keeps it in a rebuilt farmhouse on a good stone foundation, with a light in the window and a 3-legged dog asleep by the stove. If this story reminded you of someone, a quiet person in your own life, who loved in secret and looked like nobody, and was all along, somebody tell us about them in the comments. We would like very much to remember them with you.